I felt the agent's grip tighten as he whispered, "Sir, pretend I'm arresting you. Your own son triggered the alert." Still, I kept my eyes lowered, letting the floor's cold reflection steady the panic rising in my chest. As that trembling shine flickered back at me, it exposed a betrayal only family can deliver. While he guided me past the cameras, the truth cut deeper than his hold on my wrist. The same reflection showed me the son I raised and no longer recognized. That's when I understood some dangers were your last name. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Bob Callahan moved slowly down the jet bridge, the hum of airport noise echoing behind him as he stepped onto the plane. The air smelled faintly of recycled ventilation and disinfectant, familiar and strangely comforting after a week in Mexico. His knees ached from the cold front rolling in, and his shoulders still carried the weight of memories stirred up by the veteran ceremony he had attended. But there was pride too, a quiet, dignified sort of pride, as he settled into his window seat and placed his small cloth bag under the seat in front of him. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper like something fragile, was the medal gifted to him by fellow veterans. He rested his hand over the bag, almost protectively. It had been decades since someone honored him like that. He let out a slow breath and leaned back, feeling exhaustion settle into his bones. It wasn't just the travel. It was the emotion, the stories shared, the faces of men who remembered battles the world forgot. For a moment he shut his eyes and pictured his wife, Nora, the way she used to wait for him at airports with a scarf and that soft smile that always made him feel young again. This was his first international trip since she died, and it felt like reopening a part of himself he'd kept locked away. He wished she could have been here. She would have known what to say to ease the nerves he pretended not to have. The plane filled slowly. Families shuffled in, business travelers tapped on their phones, and somewhere a baby cried. Bob reached into his pocket and checked his phone. 3 unread messages from Evan. His son's name lit up the screen in a way that gave him an uneasy feeling he couldn't quite name. He opened the first text. "Did you sign the paperwork I left on the counter?" The second, "Dad, answer when you land." The third, "We need to settle this stuff before Christmas." No greeting. No "how was the ceremony?" Not even a simple "hope the flight went well." Just tasks, deadlines, pressure. It had been like that for months now, Evan treating him like an obstacle rather than a father. Bob frowned, tucked the phone away, and tried to shake off the disappointment gathering in his chest like cold fog. A flight attendant paused at his row, her smile warm and practiced. "Mr. Callahan, right?" she asked, glancing at the veteran pin on his jacket. "Thank you for your service." The words landed softly, unexpectedly. Bob felt his throat tighten as he nodded. "Thank you," he managed. It struck him that strangers now thanked him more often than his own son did. The realization sank deeper than he wanted to admit. The plane rolled back from the gate, engines rumbling. As it climbed into the sky, turbulence rippled through the cabin, small at first, then sharper, enough to make a few passengers gasp. Bob gripped the armrest, his knuckles whitening. He wasn't afraid of flying. He'd been in helicopters during storms far worse than this. But something about being suspended over hundreds of miles of ocean, on his first trip without Nora by his side, made his heart beat a little faster. A soft announcement from the captain settled the passengers, but the unease inside Bob lingered. He stared out the window as the clouds swallowed the light. He didn't know why his chest felt tight, whether it was the turbulence or the unfamiliar sensation of venturing outside his country after so long. Maybe it was the silence waiting for him at home. Maybe it was Evan's sharp texts. Maybe it was the nagging feeling he couldn't quite name, like the world had shifted slightly while he was gone. As the plane began its descent hours later, Chicago appearing below in a patchwork of lights and early winter frost, Bob found himself rehearsing the surprise he planned for Christmas. He imagined showing up at Evan's door with the small medal, maybe a bottle of bourbon, maybe a story or two from the ceremony. He imagined them laughing, maybe reconnecting, maybe repairing whatever had been cracking between them for years. It wouldn't fix everything, but it could be a start, a small gesture to remind Evan that family didn't have to be complicated. He pictured Julia too, brisk and efficient, always managing their household like it was a corporate project. He never quite knew what she thought of him, but he hoped the gesture might soften the edges, even a little. The wheels touched down with a jolt. Passengers applauded half-heartedly. Bob smiled, relieved to be back on American soil. He powered his phone on again, expecting more messages from Evan, expecting the usual rush of airport routine. What he didn't expect, what he couldn't have imagined, was that even before he set foot in the immigration hall, something hidden in a database he had never heard of had already changed his life. He stood, grabbed his bag, and stepped into the aisle with a steady breath. What waited for him at the border would be nothing like the homecoming he pictured. And he had no idea. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss as Bob stepped into the immigration hall. The familiar, institutional brightness washed over him, bouncing off polished floors and long glass partitions. People moved in tired lines, dragging suitcases, herding children, rubbing sleep from their eyes, the usual churn of an international arrival. Bob took his place in the queue, rolling his stiff shoulders, reminding himself that this was the easy part of travel. Show the passport. Answer a question or two. Welcome home. He shifted the strap of his bag and tried to shake the feeling that something in him still wasn't settled after the flight. Maybe it was just age. Maybe it was just the noise. Maybe it was just missing Nora. He tucked the thought away as he stepped forward to the counter where a young CBP officer waited, expression neutral, tired but polite. "Passport, sir," the officer said. Bob handed it over with a small nod. "Here you go, should be straightforward. I'm just coming back from a veteran event." The officer scanned the passport. A sharp beep cut through the air, a sound louder than it needed to be, and the officer's eyebrows shot up as if someone had yanked them. He stared at the screen, then at Bob, then back at the screen. The change was small but unmistakable, a tightening of the mouth, a subtle shift in posture, a second too long of silence. Bob's stomach dipped. "Is everything all right?" he asked. The officer clicked through several windows, then several more. His fingers slowed. On the monitor, lines of red text glowed like warning flares. Even from the other side of the glass, Bob saw enough shapes, codes, and highlighted terms to know something was wrong. The officer cleared his throat. "I'm seeing multiple DHS flags on your profile." Bob blinked. "Flags? What kind of flags?" The officer didn't answer immediately. He read more, his eyebrows climbing higher with every scroll. "There's a money laundering inquiry tied to your name, and an identity mismatch," he hesitated. "Also something about a potential security concern." Bob let out a short, confused exhale. "That doesn't make any sense. I don't have any overseas accounts. I barely use online banking. I've never been involved in anything like that." His voice wavered before he steadied it. "Officer, I'm a retired Army veteran. I've lived at the same address for 35 years. The officer didn't look suspicious. He looked troubled, like the computer was telling him a lie he had no authority to correct. "Sir, I understand, but these flags are coming directly from DHS. They're recent." Bob's pulse thudded in his ears. "Recent? I've been in Mexico all week. I didn't do anything except attend a ceremony. You can call anyone from the event. My commander's still alive, he'll vouch for me." But the officer wasn't listening anymore. His expression had shifted from concern to protocol mode, detached, focused, procedural. The officer slightly raised his hand to another agent a few lanes away. The gesture was subtle, but Bob caught it. The second agent approached with deliberate slowness. The first officer leaned closer and whispered a single word Bob wasn't meant to hear: "Secondary." Bob felt the word hit him like a physical blow. Secondary screenings weren't unusual, but this tone, This sudden seriousness, this whisper, it carried a weight he wasn't prepared for. "Sir," the approaching agent said, "please come with us." Bob swallowed, trying to keep his voice level. "Is this necessary? I haven't done anything wrong. We just need to clarify information." "It's standard," the second agent said, though nothing about his firm posture felt standard. Bob's chest tightened as they guided him away from the line. Travelers turned subtly, eyes following him with that quiet curiosity people reserve for situations they hope never involve them. Bob felt heat rise to his face, a mix of confusion, humiliation, and something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. They walked him down a muted hallway, past glass walls and dull gray doors. Bob could feel his heartbeat in his throat. He had been trained for danger once. He had endured combat zones, uncertainty, long deployments where the air itself felt hostile. But this, being led into a small, windowless room with nothing but a metal table, two chairs, and a camera in the corner, this felt different. This felt like losing control. "Have a seat," the agent said. He closed the door behind them with a click that sounded far too final. Bob sat slowly, hands clasped between his knees to keep them from shaking. A breath escaped him, unsteady, reluctant. He tried to ground himself, pressing his boots firmly against the floor, telling himself this was a misunderstanding, a glitch, a clerical error. But deep down, in the part of him trained to sense danger before it fully formed, he knew that something larger was in motion, something he didn't understand. And for the first time in decades, the veteran felt genuinely unsafe. The door opened again, but not for reassurance. Something else was about to happen next. The door opened with a soft, controlled push, and a man in a dark CBP uniform stepped inside. Agent Mateo Ruiz. Mid-40s, steady eyes, the kind of posture that said he'd seen enough in his career to know when something didn't smell right. But today, there was something else in his expression, something tight, restrained, almost urgent. He closed the door behind him and took a slow breath, as if preparing himself before he even spoke. Bob straightened in his chair. "Officer, is there some kind of mistake? They said there were flags, but—" Mateo lifted one hand, a subtle gesture asking for silence. Not rude, just deliberate. He sat across from Bob, opened a slim folder and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He scanned the documents inside quickly at first, then again slower. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tensed. "This doesn't look right," he murmured, mostly to himself. Bob leaned forward a little. "What do you mean?" Mateo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped to another page, then another, each one seeming to deepen the crease between his brows. Finally, he exhaled, a low, frustrated sound. He looked up. "Sir, this doesn't match your life at all." The words were quiet, but they hit Bob like a physical impact. "I'm telling you, I've never done anything illegal. I don't even understand what those flags mean." Mateo hesitated, as if debating how much he was allowed to say. His eyes flicked toward the camera in the corner of the room, the silent observer. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Callahan, listen carefully." He stood, walked around the table, and positioned himself behind Bob's chair. From anyone watching through the glass or the recording, it might have looked like he was preparing to restrain him. But instead, he leaned close, his breath barely astir against the silence. "Pretend I'm arresting you," he whispered. "Someone set you up." The words froze Bob in place. They didn't make sense, not immediately, but the sheer gravity in Mateo's tone drove a chill straight through his spine. Like the air in the room dropped 10 degrees. Bob swallowed hard. "Set me up who, why?" Mateo tightened his grip on Bob's arm, not painfully, more symbolic, like an actor following a stage cue. "Don't talk, not now." His voice was still low but sharper. "If the camera hears me explain anything, you'll be detained before I can help you." Bob's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt the terrifying disorientation of not knowing what was happening or who to trust, except this one man whose eyes held something that felt like truth, or at least urgency. Mateo gave his arm a gentle tug, guiding him out of the chair. "Stand, walk with me." To anyone watching, it would look like an escort, a detainee being moved. But the pressure on Bob's arm was loose, barely there. As they stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The corridor stretched in both directions, sterile and empty, yet Bob felt every nerve in his body humming. Mateo leaned in, just enough for the words to reach him. "Your identity was tampered with mid-flight," he said. "Not days ago, not weeks, mid-flight while you were in the air." Bob's breath caught. "How is that even possible?" "It's possible if someone on the inside is involved," Mateo replied. "Someone who knows the system, someone who wanted you flagged immediately on arrival." Bob's head swam. He tried to think of anyone at all who would want him targeted. He pictured Evan's texts, the cold impatience in them. But that didn't make sense. Evan didn't have access to government systems. He wasn't a hacker. He wasn't, no. Bob shook the thought off, forcing himself to stay present. Mateo continued guiding him down the hallway, still performing the part of an officer escorting a man in trouble. But his voice, low and urgent, painted a different reality. When your plane was over the Gulf, your profile lit up with new entries. Suspicious activity reports, security notes, financial red flags. Someone added them fast, too fast. Bob felt the floor tilting under him. "Added them, but why? I haven't done anything." "I know," Mateo said. "That's why I stepped in. And because whoever did this wants you detained, and fast." They turned a corner, but instead of heading toward the larger processing area, Mateo steered him toward a narrow service corridor Bob hadn't noticed before. A door at the end of it was marked staff only. Bob slowed. "This isn't standard, is it?" Mateo's jaw clenched. "No, and that's why you need to trust me right now." He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the hallway. No other officers. No cameras pointed directly at them. Only a faint echo of distant voices from rooms they'd already passed. Mateo pushed the staff-only door open with his elbow and ushered Bob inside. It shut behind them with a dull thud, sealing them away from the official path, and from whatever fate awaited Bob if he'd remained in it. Bob's pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't know where he was being taken, or how deep this setup went, or who on earth would want to target a retired veteran with nothing but a pension and a quiet life. But as the dim hallway stretched ahead of them, one thing was painfully clear. Whatever was happening, it was only getting worse. The service hallway felt colder than the rest of the airport, narrow, dim, humming with electrical panels and the distant throb of machinery behind the walls. Mateo walked ahead with quick, controlled steps, checking corners the way only someone trained to expect trouble would. He finally stopped near a metal door, unlocked it with a badge swipe, and guided Bob inside a small maintenance break room that looked abandoned. A vending machine humming in the corner, a table with mismatched chairs, a faint smell of old coffee. "Sit," Mateo said quietly, not commanding, protective. Bob lowered himself into the chair, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him at once. His heart was still racing. His palms were damp. He felt like he had stepped out of his life and into someone else's crisis. Mateo closed the blinds over the tiny window and set the folder on the table. "I need you to brace yourself," he said, pulling up a chair across from him. Bob's voice was unsteady. "Just tell me what's happening." Mateo opened the folder and slid a printout forward. "Someone filed a suspicious activity report in your name 2 days ago." Bob stared at the paper, trying to make sense of the foreign terms, the codes, the financial jargon. But what he understood, what hit him immediately, were the dollar figures. Large sums, international transfers, flagged accounts. "This can't be real," Bob said, shaking his head. I didn't send anything. I don't even know how to wire money overseas. Mateo nodded, almost sympathetically. The system logged 3 overseas wire transfers, supposedly from you, to accounts in Mexico and Panama. Bob felt a cold ripple move through him. I've never done that. I've never even owned property outside Illinois. Mateo turned to the next page. There's also a new Mexican property attached to your name, a beachfront condo in Baja. He tapped the paper. Completely fabricated. Someone wanted it to look like you were laundering money through a foreign real estate purchase. Bob leaned back, stunned. I've never even been to Baja, and I only got my passport a few weeks ago. My wife and we never traveled much. She wanted to, but... His voice cracked quietly, the grief still raw when he least expected it. Mateo softened. I can see that none of this fits you. That's why I intervened. Bob rubbed his face with both hands, trying to steady his breathing. How does something like this even get filed? Don't they check anything? They're supposed to, Mateo said. But if someone on the inside helps build the file, it bypasses a lot of safeguards. Bob felt his stomach twist. So what happens now? Mateo exhaled and leaned back. Higher-ups are going to want you detained overnight, maybe longer. These flags, even if they're false, make you look like a flight risk. The words hit Bob harder than he expected. Detained. As if he were some kind of criminal. As if everything he'd lived for, service, discipline, integrity, meant nothing the moment someone typed lies into a federal database. Bob reached for his phone, hands trembling. I need to call my son. Evan will know what to do. Mateo watched him carefully. Bob dialed once, straight to voicemail. He tried again, voicemail. He swallowed. He usually picks up. I don't know what's going on with him lately, but he should answer. Mateo tilted his head thoughtfully. Mr. Callahan, I need to ask you something sensitive. He folded his arms. Any family financial disputes recently? Anything involving money, accounts, wills, or disagreements? Bob froze. The question didn't feel random. He thought of Evan's recent behavior, the sudden pressure to sign paperwork, the questions about power of attorney, the cold tone in his texts, the impatience. Julia's insistence on planning for the future, her probing about his pension, the way Evan looked at him. Now not like a father but like an obligation, or worse, an opportunity. But saying it out loud felt like betrayal, like naming a wound he wasn't ready to admit existed. I don't know, Bob said, voice low. He's been stressed, talking about finances. He wanted me to sign some things, but I didn't think it meant anything. Mateo's eyes sharpened. People under financial pressure do desperate things, and sometimes they find bad company. Bob's breath caught. You're not saying my own son. I'm saying someone with access to your personal information helped whoever planted this. Mateo leaned closer. And family is often the first leak. The words sat between them like a bomb. Bob stared at his shaking hands. The thought that Evan could have played any part, even accidentally, made something inside him fracture. Mateo closed the folder gently. I'm going to stall the detainment order. I can buy you a little time, but not much. Bob looked up, voice barely steady. Why are you helping me? Because this smells wrong, Mateo said quietly, and because you don't deserve to walk into a trap blind. He stood, lowering his voice even further. Stay alert, Mr. Callahan. Bob felt his breath hitch. More was coming. Something worse. And he wasn't ready for it. The holding room felt smaller the second time they placed Bob inside it. The overhead light buzzed with a faint, flickering tremor, the kind of nervous hum that made the air feel colder than it should. Mateo had slipped out moments earlier to delay paperwork, leaving Bob alone with nothing but his thoughts and the sound of distant footsteps echoing through concrete hallways. He tried to steady himself. He interlaced his fingers, pressed them together, and forced a long, controlled breath. He'd been in worse places as a young soldier, but this was different. This time, He wasn't fighting an enemy he could see. This time, the danger was paper, screens, hidden hands moving in the dark. Then his phone buzzed. Bob flinched. He wasn't expecting anyone, he wasn't expecting anything, but the vibration rattled against the metal table like a warning shot. He pulled the phone closer. The text preview hit him harder than any punch he'd taken in his life. "Evan, where are you? Need to talk about your accounts." Bob stared at the words, his throat tightening. Accounts? Why now? Why today of all days when he was detained, flagged, frightened? How could Evan know to ask this right now? Another vibration followed almost instantly. Not a message. An alert. Suspicious login attempt detected. Callahan Pension Portal. Bob's breath stalled. He'd memorized that login years ago. He'd never shared it, not with Mark, not with Nora, not with anyone. The pension was one of the last pieces of stability he had, the one thing he never wanted burdening his son. But someone had tried to access it. And the timing wasn't coincidence. His hands trembled as he unlocked the phone. "No," he whispered. "He wouldn't do that, he wouldn't." Another vibration, this time a text from Julia. "Julia, did you sign the transfer? Time sensitive." The words hit him like ice water poured straight into his chest. Transfer. Time sensitive. She wasn't asking about his safety, or his return, or why he hadn't answered since yesterday. She was asking about money. Bob suddenly saw the picture with painful clarity. Evan's pressure, Julia's constant hints, their insistence on power of attorney just in case, the suspicious questions about his pension, and now today, the day he was flagged, detained, blocked from entering the country, they were suddenly frantic about account access. They expected him to be stuck here. He felt his ribs tighten, breath shortening. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God," they knew. The door clicked open. Mateo stepped back inside, a stack of papers in hand, his face tense from whatever he'd been doing in the corridor. "I bought you an hour," he said. "Maybe less. They're pushing hard for detainment." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Bob's expression. "What happened?" Mateo asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Bob tried to swallow, but his throat felt dry, locked. He held up the phone with shaking fingers. It's my son." Mateo stepped closer, scanning the screen. He didn't touch the phone, didn't pry, but the implication was clear. "Explain," he said quietly. Bob lowered his gaze. It felt like the hardest confession he had ever made. "My son, he's been asking for access to my accounts lately, pressuring me, talking about transfers, power of attorney." His voice cracked. "I didn't think he meant anything by it. I thought he was just stressed." Mateo's jaw hardened. "And he texted you now, while you're in detainment?" Bob nodded, asking about my accounts, and someone tried logging into my pension. His voice broke into a whisper. "He has my details, he must." Mateo's face changed, not in shock, but in recognition, like a puzzle piece finally snapped into place. "They set you up to be stuck at the border," he said, his tone low, steady, deadly calm. "Whoever filed those false reports expected you to be out of the country long enough to push financial changes through." Bob felt a wave of nausea sweep through him. "My own son," he whispered. "My only child." Mateo crouched slightly to meet Bob's eyes. "Mr. Callahan, listen to me. I need to know something. Did you give him any documents recently? Anything with personal numbers, bank statements, pension information?" Bob closed his eyes, pain washing across his face. "He helped me set up online access months ago. I thought he was just being responsible." He opened his eyes, voice barely audible. "I never imagined he'd." Mateo didn't let him finish. His voice softened, but only slightly. "I'm sorry, but right now we need to focus on the immediate danger." Bob looked at him, desperate, lost, shaken. "What do I do?" Mateo put a hand on the back of the chair, grounding him. "First, you stay calm. Second, you stay with me. I can delay the detainment but not stop it. His voice dropped to a whisper. And third, you tell me everything you remember about what your son asked for. Bob wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, anger and heartbreak mixing in a way that made his chest ache. A setup. His own son. And the sinking realization that this betrayal was only the beginning. Mateo straightened, listening to voices approaching from the hall. "Mr. Callahan," he whispered urgently, "it's about to get harder." And the door handle began to turn. Mateo moved fast, faster than Bob thought a federal officer should ever have to move. He opened doors, whispered instructions to colleagues, and tapped hurriedly on a tablet as if time itself were tightening around them. Bob stood beside him, feeling like a man walking on a frozen lake while the cracks spread under his boots. Finally, Mateo turned back to him. "I found a loophole," he said quietly. "A medical release technicality. You don't qualify, but I made it fit." Bob blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means you're free to go, temporarily." Mateo held his gaze. 6 hours. After that, you're expected back here for continued processing. They'll push to detain you overnight if you return alone. Bob felt the words land with a strange mixture of relief and dread. 6 hours to do what? 6 hours to get safe, Mateo said. And 6 hours to decide who you can trust. Use them wisely. He handed Bob his phone and passport, objects that suddenly felt heavier, more dangerous than before. Then he opened the side exit door to a service ramp that emptied into a restricted parking area. "Go," Mateo whispered, "and stay alert. Someone wanted you trapped. They won't be happy you slipped out." Bob stepped into the cold Chicago air, sharp, winter-bitten, and painfully real. The wind cut across his face, waking him fully in a way the fluorescent airport lights couldn't. He tucked his jacket tight and walked, feeling the disorientation of a man thrown out of his own life. His phone vibrated in his hand. A notification. Another pension login attempt. He swallowed hard and ignored it, instead scrolling to Evan's number. He hesitated, but he pressed call. It rang only once. Evan answered, breathless and irritated. "Dad, finally, where are you? I've been waiting for you to handle those documents." Bob's jaw tightened. "What documents?" "The ones I told you about yesterday," Evan snapped. "You said you'd review them. We need to sort this out before the end of the month." Bob stopped walking. "Evan, someone tried to access my pension today." Silence, then Evan let out a dramatic sigh. "Dad, not this again. You're forgetting things. I told you we needed to streamline your accounts." "I didn't forget," Bob said, voice breaking with anger and fear. "You tried to log in, I saw the alerts. And Julia keeps messaging me about transfers." That name seemed to change something. Evan's tone shifted from irritation to defensive coldness. "She's helping me keep us organized. You've been all over the place lately, Dad. Look, you barely remember conversations anymore." Bob closed his eyes. The lie stabbed deeper than he expected. "I remember enough," he said. "I remember what trust is supposed to look like." In the background, Julia's voice rose sharply. "Is he blaming us? Put it on speaker." Before Bob could protest, her voice cut through the line, sharp, clipped, dripping with accusation. "Bob, this is ridiculous. You had one simple task: sign the transfer papers. Our entire financial planning is now on hold because of you." Bob felt his throat close. "Planning for what? Why are you pushing so hard for access to my accounts?" Julia scoffed. "Because you're careless. You could lose everything, and then where does that leave your family?" He felt the sting of that word, family, used like a weapon instead of a bond. Evan added, quieter but colder than before, "Dad, we're just trying to help you, but you're making this so difficult." Bob felt something inside him fracture. "I called because I needed your support," he said softly. "I'm in trouble, and instead of asking if I'm okay, you two are worried about paperwork." Julia snapped. if you've messed up something legally." Bob ended the call before she could finish. He stood there, phone in hand, snow beginning to drift through the air. The cold no longer stung, the betrayal did. The truth pressed down on him with devastating clarity. Evan wasn't just stressed. He wasn't confused. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was involved. And maybe he'd been involved for longer than Bob wanted to admit. A slow, painful breath escaped him. His hands trembled again, not from fear this time, but from heartbreak. He needed someone who wouldn't question him, someone who wouldn't exploit him, someone who knew him before life got complicated. There was only one name that made sense: Mark Hilburn. Bob tightened his coat and started toward the taxi stand, each step heavy but resolute. Mark was the one person left in his life he could trust, the only person who might help him make sense of the nightmare closing in. As he headed off into the freezing Chicago night, 6 hours ticking away like a countdown, he didn't know what waited on the other side of Mark's front door. But he knew he couldn't face what came next alone. Snow clung to the edges of Mark Hilburn's porch like frostbitten lace when Bob finally reached the house. He knocked twice, his knuckles stiff from cold and nerves. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing Mark broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, and wearing the same flannel jacket he'd had since their army days. His eyes widened the moment he saw Bob's face. "Jesus, Bob, you look like hell." Mark stepped aside without another word, ushering him in with a firm hand on his back. The house smelled of wood polish and old books, the same comforting scent Bob remembered from years of weekend visits. "What happened?" Mark asked, locking the door behind them. Bob stood in the entryway for a moment, as if steadying himself before diving underwater. "You better sit down," he said quietly. Mark didn't sit, he just stared, concern already turning into suspicion. "Tell me." So Bob did. He told him about the DHS flags, the fake reports, the interview room. He repeated Mateo's whisper, "Pretend I'm arresting you. Someone set you up." He showed Mark the text from Evan, the pension login alerts, Julia's message about transfers. Every piece of the nightmare spilled out of him in uneven breaths. By the time he finished, Mark looked like he'd aged 5 years in the span of 10 minutes. "Your own kid," Mark murmured, sinking into a chair. "Damn it, Bob, that's low, even for Evan." Bob bristled. "Don't say it like that, you don't know that it's him." Mark raised an eyebrow. "I do. The man texts you about accounts the very minute you're detained. And Julia, that woman's had dollar signs in her eyes since their wedding." He paused, frustration sharpening his tone. "Bob, you know she's obsessed with status. Everything with her is about appearances, promotions, vacations, money. Evan didn't wake up greedy on his own." Bob turned away, unable to argue but unwilling to accept it. "He's my son. And good men make terrible decisions when someone whispers the right poison into their ear," Mark replied. "You know that from the service." Bob rubbed his forehead, exhausted by the truth he wasn't ready to say out loud. Mark motioned toward the dining table. "Sit, we're digging through your accounts." "What good will that do?" Bob muttered. "It'll tell us who's been messing with you." Mark pulled out his laptop and slid it across the table toward Bob. "Log in, start with your pension." Bob hesitated, then did as told. His fingers shook as he typed the password. Mark watched the screen with the intensity of a man defusing a bomb. Within seconds, unusual access logs popped into view. IP addresses Bob didn't recognize, login attempts from 2 different locations within the past week, and several incomplete password recovery attempts. "What the hell?" Mark muttered. "These started before your trip." Bob's heart sank. "Before I left." Mark nodded grimly. "Someone's been probing your accounts for days." Bob clicked over to his insurance page, something he rarely touched. The moment the page loaded, a notification flashed. "Policy activation attempt, pending review." Bob stared at it. "I didn't activate anything. I haven't touched that policy in years. My. RK leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Look at the date. Bob's breath caught in his chest. 3 days ago. Which meant Evan, or someone using his information, filed the activation request while Bob was already in Mexico. At the very same time, the false DHS reports were being created. Mark shook his head, fear mixing with anger. Bob, this isn't random. Someone wanted you tied up out of the country, distracted. Bob pressed his hands against his face, fighting the rising panic. It can't be Evan, he wouldn't do this, not intentionally. Mark slammed his palm gently against the table. Stop protecting him, Bob. Your son's drowning in debt, his marriage is hanging by a thread, and Julia pushes him like a mule. You think he wouldn't rationalize taking a little help from your accounts? Bob felt a sharp pain behind his ribs, the ache of someone being forced to look at a truth he'd been avoiding. We need a lawyer, Mark said firmly. Right now, before DHS tries to pull you back in. Bob shook his head. No, not yet. Mark stared at him, incredulous. Bob. He's my son, Bob whispered. I can't believe he'd do something like this. Not without being coerced or pressured. I need to know before I accuse him of something that'll destroy us for good. Bob, Mark tried again. But Bob lifted a trembling hand, stopping him. I'm not ready to believe he betrayed me, he said softly. Not completely, not yet. Mark leaned back, studying him with a mix of frustration and compassion, the look of a friend torn between protecting someone and respecting their grief. Then be careful, Mark finally said, because whether you accept it or not, someone close to you already started pulling the trigger. Bob lowered his gaze, heart heavy. The storm wasn't slowing. It was just beginning. Bob hadn't slept. Not really. He sat in Mark's living room with the lights dimmed, staring at old photos on the mantel, Mark in uniform beside him, Nora smiling between them at a summer barbecue years before Evan was even born. Everything felt impossibly distant now, like a life someone else had lived. Mark was in the kitchen making strong coffee when Bob's phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. Bob frowned. Who would? Mark called out, if it's Evan, let it go. You don't owe that boy any more conversations tonight. But the number didn't look like Evan S. or Julia S. Bob answered anyway. Hello. A low voice whispered urgently, Mr. Callahan, it's Mateo. Don't say my name out loud. Bob sat up straight. Mateo, what's going on? There was a breath, quick and tense. Listen carefully. I don't have long. DHS just pulled me off your case. Bob felt his pulse spike. Why? Because I pushed too many questions, Mateo said. Because I asked for verification on your file. Because I wouldn't sign off on the detainment recommendation. His voice darkened. And because someone higher up doesn't want me anywhere near you. Bob's mouth went dry. So who did they replace you with? Mateo hesitated, and that hesitation told Bob everything before the name even left his lips. Agent Kara Summers. Bob didn't know her, but the tone in Mateo's voice made the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Should I be worried? Mateo exhaled sharply. She's known internally for fast-tracking questionable financial alerts. She pushes things through without checking details. She has connections outside DHS that make people nervous. Private sector groups, consultants, entities looking for vulnerable seniors with assets. Bob gripped the edge of the table. So she's tied to whatever's happening to me. Tied? Mateo scoffed under his breath. She's the spider in half the webs. And if she's on your file, it means someone didn't just file a false report. They made sure the right person would handle it. Bob felt a wave of cold settle into him. This isn't just Evan, is it? No, Mateo said firmly. This is bigger, more organized. Then his voice dropped even lower. And if Kara gets hold of you again, you won't get another release. Don't go back to the airport. Not until you have legal protection. Bob closed his eyes. The room felt like it was tilting. I only have a few hours left before they expect me. Don't return, Mateo repeated. Not without representation, not without evidence. They're building something around you and they're almost done. I'm risking my job calling you. Bob swallowed hard. Mateo, thank you. A beat of silence. Stay alive, Mateo said quietly, and stay hidden. The line went dead. Bob lowered the phone, staring at it as if it might ring again. It didn't. Mark stepped out from the kitchen. Who was that? You look like you got news from the morgue. Bob took a shaky breath. Mateo, he's off the case. They put a woman named Kara Summers in charge. Mark's jaw flexed. Summers, I've heard of her. Benton mentioned her once at a neighborhood crime meeting. Fast-tracking financial cases, questionable ties. He shook his head. She's bad news. Bob stared at him. He told me not to go back. He said she's tied to outside groups. This isn't just about Evan anymore. It's bigger. As if on cue, Bob's phone buzzed again, then again, and again. 3 voicemails, all from Evan. Bob played the first on speaker. Evan's voice erupted immediately, angry, panicked. Dad, what the hell are you doing? We need those documents signed today. Call me back. The second voicemail. Are you ignoring us now? Because of your paranoia, you're making this worse. The third one was harsher, Evan's voice cracking with frustration. Dad, sign the damn forms. Julia's furious. You're ruining our financial planning. Stop being stubborn. Bob's face went pale. He's not even pretending to care if I'm okay. Mark muttered, he sounds like a man who knows time is running out. For him. Bob sank into the couch, exhausted. I can't believe this is my son. Mark sat beside him, voice heavy with concern. Bob, listen to me. You need an attorney. Now. This isn't a family squabble anymore. It's a coordinated hit on your identity and assets. If you walk into DHS alone, they'll bury you. Bob rubbed his face with trembling hands. I was hoping. Maybe Evan didn't know what he was doing. Maybe this was Julia's idea. Maybe. No, Mark said gently but firmly. You don't get to live in maybe anymore. You need protection. Bob closed his eyes, grief tightening in his chest. Admitting it felt like admitting his world had already collapsed. But he nodded. Okay, he whispered, call the attorney. Mark didn't waste a second. He reached for his phone, already dialing. Bob leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls of the trap closing in, feeling the betrayal settle deeper, heavier. He had no idea what the attorney would uncover. But he knew the next move would change everything. Rachel Marsh looked nothing like the attorneys Bob saw on television. No flashy suit, no theatrical confidence. She wore a navy cardigan, thin-framed glasses, and an expression sharpened by years of navigating bureaucratic chaos. Her office was small but organized, every file labeled, every document stacked with military precision. It made Bob feel slightly exposed, as if his entire life could be unspooled here in a single afternoon. All right, Rachel said, pulling her chair closer to the desk. Show me everything you and Mark found. Bob handed her a folder, account logs, screenshots, email alerts, even the hospital dry printouts Mateo had slipped him at the airport. Rachel flipped through the pages with quick, practiced movements. Her eyes narrowed almost instantly. Forged, she muttered. Bob blinked. What? She tapped a page showing the pension login attempts. These recovery requests, they were done with partial Social Security data and an outdated verification method. Someone who didn't have full access tried to brute force their way in. She turned to another document. And here, whoever attempted this used device fingerprints that don't match yours, not even close. Bob swallowed, a heavy knot forming in his throat. So someone stole my information. Rachel nodded slowly. Stole it or was given it. She didn't look up as she said it. Bob's stomach twisted. She pulled out another printout, the false Mexican property tied to his name. And this is sloppy. Wrong formatting, wrong metadata, wrong recorder's office ID. Whoever added this didn't even bother to check the regional property codes. Mark exhaled sharply. So someone fabricated Mexican assets to make him look dirty. Exactly, Rachel said. She leaned back, fingers steepled. But the most concerning part is the suspicious activity report. Those aren't filed casually. That requires someone with access to banking systems, federal channels, or a corrupted link inside DHS. Bob rubbed his temples. Mateo hinted someone inside was helping. I believe him, she said, because this SAR wasn't generated naturally. It was pushed. That's the word we use when someone feeds a fraud alert into the system manually, bypassing normal triggers. Mark let out a low whistle. So they created a paper trail before Bob even left the country. Rachel nodded, which means the target wasn't random. Bob stared at the desk, voice cracking. Why me? Rachel watched him closely. Tell me about your son. Bob hesitated. His throat tightened, grief and humiliation fighting for space. He's had money problems. His wife, Julia, she's obsessed with status. Promotions, houses, cars. He's been asking about my accounts, pressuring me to sign things. Rachel didn't look surprised. Do you think he'd ever share your information with someone, maybe unknowingly? Bob's voice was barely a whisper. I don't want to believe that. Belief isn't evidence, Rachel replied gently, but patterns are. She turned to her computer, typing quickly. Before we go any further, I'm calling someone. Who? Bob asked. Detective Laura Benton, Rachel said. Financial Crimes Unit. If what I'm seeing is part of something bigger, she'll know. She pressed dial. Within seconds, a voice answered, brisk, no nonsense, familiar with pressure. Benton. Laura, it's Rachel. I'm sending you a file. Senior male, veteran, targeted with forged financial red flags and a false SAR. Looks a lot like the other cases you mentioned. There was a pause, then Benton's tone changed, sharper, colder. You're serious. Dead serious, Rachel said. Check the timestamps. Bob and Mark watched as Rachel sent the documents. Another pause. Then Benton spoke again, voice weighted with certainty. This matches 4 other victims we've been tracking. Seniors, pensions, family stress, false detainment triggers. She inhaled sharply. Tell your client he's not alone. Whoever's doing this, they're organized. Bob felt his chest sink. So Evan, he got mixed up with people like that. Rachel muted the call and turned to him. I think Evan got involved with something he didn't understand. Maybe he thought he was getting financial help. Maybe he thought it was legal. Her voice softened. But he pulled you into the mess. Bob looked down at his hands, hands that once held rifles, fixed engines, carried his wife across their threshold, now shaking because his own son had unknowingly opened the door to predators. He didn't mean for this, Bob whispered. He can't have meant for this. Rachel returned to the call. We'll be in touch, Laura. She hung up and faced Bob directly. Her tone was firm now, not unkind but unyielding. Bob, you cannot contact Evan again. Not by phone, not by text, not by anything. If he's connected to the people behind this, even accidentally, reaching out could compromise everything. Bob shook his head instinctively. He's my son. And that's exactly why they'll use him, Rachel replied. You need to stay silent. Let me and Detective Benton handle the next steps. Bob felt something settle inside him, not calm, not courage, but a kind of exhausted acceptance. The truth was too large to negotiate with, too heavy to deny. He looked at Rachel. What do we do next? Rachel rested her hand on the file. Now, Bob, we prepare for the fight ahead. And for the first time since he'd boarded the plane home, Bob understood. This was only the beginning. Rachel's office became a war room by mid-morning. Her desk, usually spotless, was now buried under printouts, screenshots, USB drives, and handwritten notes pinned to legal pads. The blinds were half closed, giving the room a dim, investigative hum, the kind of atmosphere where truth didn't just come to light, it was hunted down. Rachel sat across from Bob, scrolling rapidly through government portal logs. "These DHS flags," she muttered, "aren't just sloppy. They're patched in from two separate internal nodes. Someone used a ghost terminal." Bob watched the screen, feeling both out of place and painfully invested. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Rachel said, pushing her glasses up. "Someone inside DHS forged these alerts, and they tried to mask it by routing entries through a supervisor's inactive account. Classic corruption tactic." She clicked a button and began downloading the logs. "We're preserving every scrap of digital evidence before Kara Summers wipes them." Bob nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed into his ribs like a slow bruise. "How long do we have before they notice?" Rachel didn't look up. "Not long, which is why we need to move fast." She opened her recorder app and slid it across the table toward him. "Time for the video." Bob stiffened. "The what?" "The legally guided message," Rachel clarified. "This isn't a send to Evan, it's for protection. If DHS detains you again, we need your version of events documented, time-stamped, and admissible." Bob exhaled shakily, feeling the room shrink around him. "I don't know what to say." Rachel leaned forward. "Tell the truth. The moment Evan pressured you, the login attempts, the signatures, the questions about your assets, no emotion, just facts." He swallowed hard, lifted the phone, and hit record. His voice came slowly at first. "My name is Robert Callahan. I'm recording this under legal guidance." The words felt heavy, unnatural, but he pushed through them, describing Evan's texts, Julia's demands, the pressure, the betrayal he still wasn't ready to name out loud. His throat tightened halfway through. But he kept going. When he finished, he handed Rachel the phone with a quiet, exhausted nod. She saved the file. "Good, now we move to the next step." As if on cue, Mark walked in carrying a stack of folders. "Got everything you asked for," he said. "Travel receipts, boarding passes, timestamps. Hell, I even printed out his itinerary from the Veterans Ceremony website." Bob managed a tired smile. Mark's always been thorough. Mark dropped the folders onto the table. "If we're building a timeline, it's going to be airtight." Rachel flipped through the documents, nodding. "This proves you were out of the country when half these reports were filed. Strong evidence in your favor." Bob let out a slow breath. "At least something is." Before anyone could reply, Rachel's desk phone buzzed, a secure line. She answered briskly. "Marsh." Detective Benton's voice came through, low and focused. "Subpoena is in. We're pulling Kara Summers' financial records right now." Rachel straightened. And she's dirty," Benton said. "Money flowing through consulting shells, offshore routing, private contract payments she never reported. This woman isn't working alone." Bob felt a cold tremor crawl up his spine. Even though he suspected it, hearing confirmation made the danger feel 10 times more real. Rachel hung up and turned to him. "This proves Kara's tied to the same network targeting you." Before Bob could respond, the door knocked, soft, cautious. Mark stepped aside. As Rachel opened it, Mateo Ruiz slipped in, wearing plain clothes, eyes darting to every corner of the room. He closed the door behind him and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for miles. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly, "but you need this." He handed Rachel a sealed envelope, thick, bulging with papers. "Internal memos," Mateo said, "drafted under Kara's name but never approved. Fake notes about your detainment, false timelines. She planned to mark you as uncooperative. They were building grounds to justify an extended hold." Bob felt the blood drain from his face. "They were trying to lock me up long-term." Mateo nodded grimly. And they would have succeeded if I didn't stall the paperwork. Rachel opened the envelope, scanning the contents with growing intensity. This is gold, risky but gold. Mateo looked at Bob then, really looked, with a mix of apology and determination. I'm sorry this happened to you. You served your country and your country should have protected you, but I'm not letting them bury you. Bob felt something tighten in his throat, gratitude, fear, anger, a storm of emotion he couldn't name. Mateo slipped out quietly, leaving the envelope behind. Silence fell over the room. Then Bob's phone vibrated. A text from Evan. We'll talk when you calm down. Bob stared at the message. Something inside him, something soft, fragile, paternal, finally cracked. Not with grief this time, but with a cold, steady resolve he hadn't felt since the military. Mark noticed the shift in his eyes. You all right, old friend? Bob set the phone down. No, he said quietly, but I know what I have to be. Rachel closed the file on the desk, ready to keep going. Bob looked at her, jaw tightening. A veteran wasn't being hunted anymore. He was preparing for war again. And this time, the battlefield was personal. Kara Summers found out faster than Rachel expected. Word traveled through DHS like a winter wildfire. Bob Callahan lawyered up. And the moment Kara heard it, something in the machinery of the system shifted. The pressure intensified. Warnings multiplied. Quiet emails began circulating with language crafted to look official but laced with urgency. By noon, Rachel's inbox lit up with alerts. Summers just filed a detainment escalation, Rachel said, scrolling through the notice, brows furrowed. She's pushing for an immediate hold. No hearing, no review. Bob felt the blood drain from his face, even though you filed the injunction. Rachel clicked another tab, which is exactly why she's accelerating. She wants to get ahead of me. Mark paced behind them, jaw tight. This Kara woman, she's scared. She knows you're not going down quietly. Rachel opened a digital form and began typing with surgical precision. She's scared because her cover is cracking. We're petitioning a federal judge today. If the judge grants a stay, DHS can't touch you until a full review. Bob watched her fingers fly across the keyboard, but his breathing wasn't steady anymore. His hands trembled. His chest tightened. The room felt suddenly too small, too warm, too loud. Ka. Bob pressed a hand to his sternum, struggling to breathe. Feels like my lungs won't open. Mark was beside him in 2 strides. Hey, Bob, look at me. His voice softened, the same tone he used decades ago when they dug each other out of foxholes, covered in mud and fear. Slow breath. You survived combat. You survived worse than this. You hear me? Bob tried. The air came in thin threads, but Mark steadied him, a grounding hand on his shoulder, unwavering, solid. Rachel didn't stop typing. Panic attack, she said calmly. Expected. He's under federal pressure and betrayed by his own family. Mark, keep him steady. I'll finish the petition. Bob closed his eyes and focused on the rhythm of Mark's voice. It took nearly a minute before he felt his lungs open again, like rusted hinges slowly giving way. When he settled, Rachel printed a document and slid it into a folder. The judge has it. Now we wait. Bob leaned back, exhausted, sweat beading at his temples. I didn't think it would get this bad. I didn't think. It's designed to feel suffocating, Rachel said. That's how corruption survives. But the storm wasn't done. Rachel's phone buzzed. She listened, expression darkening. What do you mean Mateo's been reassigned? When? A pause. That fast. Another pause. Fine, send me the file. She hung up and turned to Bob. Mateo's off the case, completely, not just reassigned, removed. Bob shook his head. Because he helped me. Because he threatened Kara's plan, Rachel corrected. She can't risk honest eyes anywhere near your file. Bob felt that familiar heaviness again, the sense of being hunted not for who he was, but for what someone could take from him. The next hours were eerily quiet. No calls from DHS, no update from the judge, the kind of silence that felt staged, like someone was holding their breath. Before a strike. Even Evan was silent. Bob checked his phone. No new messages, no missed calls, no angry accusations or frantic demands for signatures. Nothing. "They're disappearing," Bob murmured. "Evan and Julia, they're hiding." Mark didn't sugarcoat it. "Because they know something's coming. They're scared you're finding things out." Bob swallowed, throat tight. "He's my son. He should be calling me, not avoiding me." Rachel's voice softened. "People facing consequences don't run toward the truth. They run from it." Bob set the phone down slowly. The silence from Evan cut deeper than any threat because it confirmed the one thing he wasn't ready to face. His son wasn't confused. He wasn't pressured. He wasn't manipulated. He was guilty and retreating. Bob stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the sky was an overcast sheet of dull gray, the kind of winter day that blurred into evening without warning. For a moment, his reflection stared back at him, older, worn, but still standing. "Still fighting." He inhaled through his nose, held it, then exhaled. "Whatever comes next, I need to be ready." Mark stepped beside him. "We'll be ready, all of us." Rachel stacked the folders with finality. "The judge will decide soon. Once that decision comes down, everything changes." Bob nodded slowly. Fear still sat in his chest, but something else sat beside it now. Resolve. The calm before a confrontation he could feel coming like a pressure shift in the air. Whatever happened next, he would face it head-on. And the storm hadn't fully arrived yet. Mark's house sat in a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of suburban stillness that usually brought comfort. But that afternoon, as Bob stared out the front window with a cup of untouched coffee trembling in his hands, something in the air felt charged, heavy, wrong. Mark noticed it too. "You all right?" he asked from behind him. Bob didn't answer. He couldn't. His chest felt tight with a strange mix of grief and anger that he couldn't name. A car rolled slowly to a stop outside, Evan's gray sedan. Bob froze. Mark cursed under his breath. How the hell did he even know you were here? Before Bob could speak, the driver's door flew open. Evan stepped out, slamming it hard enough to rattle the frame. He marched up the walkway with tight, frantic steps. His hair was uncombed, his face pale. And behind him, in the passenger seat, Julia sat rigidly, arms folded, refusing to look toward the house. Mark turned to Bob. "Do you want me to handle this?" "No," Bob whispered, setting the cup down. "I need to hear what he has to say." But deep down, he already knew. A moment later, Evan burst through the front door without knocking, a habit he used to be scolded for when he was young. Now, he acted like the house owed him entry. "Dad, we need to talk," Evan snapped. His voice wasn't worried. It wasn't gentle. It was frantic and accusatory, like Bob had created an inconvenience instead of being hunted by federal corruption. Mark stepped forward immediately. "Watch your tone, son. This is my home." Evan ignored him. He jabbed a finger toward Bob. "Why didn't you come home? Why are you hiding here? You're making everything harder." Bob met his eyes with a tired, steady look. "Harder for who, Evan? You, or the people you got mixed up with?" Evan flinched almost imperceptibly but pushed forward. "You're blowing everything out of proportion. If you had just signed the paperwork, none of this would be happening." Mark scoffed. "He got detained at the border because someone used his information, and you're worried about paperwork." Evan's eyes twitched toward the window, toward Julia waiting in the car, then back to Bob. "Dad, can we talk alone?" "No," Bob said simply. "Whatever you have to say it here." The firmness in his father's voice startled Evan. He blinked, thrown off balance, then tried a different approach, frustration disguised as concern. "You're confused. You've been forgetful. Julia and I have been trying to help you manage your accounts." Bob let out a quiet breath, steady but razor-sharp. "You weren't helping me. You were helping yourselves." Evan stiffened. "That's not fair." "No," Bob stepped closer, eyes never leaving his son's. "Then explain the forged power of attorney." The words dropped into the room like a stone through glass. Evan's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, no words came. His throat bobbed. His eyes darted once more to the car, where Julia sat motionless, staring straight ahead like she'd rehearsed for this moment. Mark folded his arms. "Go on, Evan, tell him." I didn't forge anything," Evan stammered. "Julia handled most of that. I didn't know what she was doing." Bob's heart cracked at how fast the blame shifted, how quickly Evan turned on the woman he'd defended for years. "That document wasn't just mishandled," Bob said quietly. "It had my signature on it, a signature I didn't write." Evan swallowed hard. She said we aided it to protect you." Bob shook his head slowly. "And you believed her, or did you just like the idea of easy money?" Evan's face twisted. "Dad, we're drowning. The mortgage, the debts, you don't understand the pressure we've been under. We weren't trying to hurt you. We were trying to survive." "By stealing from me?" Bob asked, voice soft but devastating. "That's not what this was," Evan snapped, his emotion collapsing into panic. "You're twisting it." "No," Bob said. "You twisted it. You let her convince you that my life, my identity, my future were bargaining chips." Evan took a step back, breath shaking. "Dad, please." Bob raised a hand, stopping him. The old soldier in him spoke now, steady, controlled, heartbreak buried beneath discipline. "Evan, I've given you every chance to do the right thing, every chance to speak honestly, every chance to be a man I could trust." Evan's eyes shone with something like shame or fear of consequences, not moral regret. "And you chose this," Bob said, voice barely above a whisper. "You're my son, but you chose this." The words hit harder than any yell could have. Evan's face crumpled. For a moment he looked like he might apologize, might fall apart at his father's feet, admit everything. Instead, he bolted for the door. "Evan," Mark barked, but Evan was already outside, sprinting back to the car. Julia avoided eye contact with Bob as Evan yanked the door open. She looked terrified, not of guilt, but of exposure. The car peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching, leaving a trail of cold exhaust in the winter air. Bob watched it disappear down the street. He didn't chase after it. He simply stood there, shoulders heavy, breath unsteady, the wound of betrayal no longer imagined, no longer avoidable. It was real. And now there was no going back. Detective Laura Benton arrived at Rachel's office with a file so thick it looked like it could snap the metal clip holding it together. She didn't bother with greetings. She dropped the file on the table with a heavy thud. "Your instincts were right," Benton said, breath sharp from rushing. "Kara Summers has been on the take for years. We just didn't have the proof until now." Bob felt the room tilt, not from shock, but from confirmation, the kind that made the danger feel more real than ever. Rachel opened the folder, scanning the documents. "Bribes," she murmured. "Multiple, from financial brokers, offshore consultants, private recovery firms." "And one shell company," Benton added, "connected to a fraud ring we've been tracking for months." Mark leaned over Bob's shoulder. "So she wasn't just corrupt, she was partnered with criminals." "Not partnered," Benton corrected, "paid." That word cut sharper than any other. Paid. Someone had paid Kara Summers to weaponize federal systems against civilians, against seniors, against people like Bob. Rachel's voice sharpened. "This is enough for federal charges: obstruction, falsifying federal records, abuse of authority, racketeering." Benton nodded. "And she's going to face all of it." Bob exhaled slowly, the weight of the truth settling into his bones. "But why me? Why target me?" Benton opened another page. Because you're not the only one. Bob's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Kara filed similar false DHS flags against 4 other seniors, Benton said. All men, all over 60, all with pensions, insurance, property, or savings that made them attractive targets. Bob's throat tightened, so this wasn't personal. It became personal, Rachel said, the moment your information got leaked to them through someone close to you. Bob closed his eyes, the ache in his chest returning. Evan's face flashed in his mind, panicked, defensive, running. Julia's stiff posture in the car, their silence afterward. He tried not to think about it. He tried not to let the grief hollow him out. But there was no escaping it. Before anyone could speak again, Bob's phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. His hands shook as he answered, "Hello." A hushed voice came through, strained but familiar. "Mr. Callahan, it's Mateo. I don't have long." Bob straightened. "Mateo, are you okay?" "No," Mateo whispered. "They pulled me off the case entirely. My badge was flagged for protocol violations. They're trying to bury my involvement." Bob felt anger burn through him. "Because you helped me." "Because I exposed them," Mateo corrected. "Listen closely. I found something before my access was revoked. Internal confirmation." His voice dropped lower. "Kara falsified your records, all of them. She fabricated the Mexican condo, the wire transfers, even the identity mismatch." Bob felt cold all over. "So she built the entire trap." "And she's done it before," Mateo said. "Those other seniors, same patterns, same digital fingerprints, same ghost terminal she used for you." Mark muttered a curse under his breath. Rachel grabbed a pen. "Mateo, can you send me her digital activity logs?" "I already did," he whispered. "Check your encrypted folder, but be careful. Kara has people watching her tracks and anyone who interferes." Bob's heart pounded. "Thank you," he said, voice thick. "I mean it." Mateo paused. "You deserve justice, Mr. Callahan. Don't let them silence you." Then the line went dead. Rachel was already opening the secure folder. He wasn't kidding. "These logs are damning." Benton leaned in, eyes narrowing. "We can move on this today." Bob pressed a hand to the table, steadying himself. The betrayal spread wider now, not just government corruption, not just Kara, not just anonymous criminals. It reached into his home, his family, his son's marriage. And then Benton said something that made his stomach twist. "We made another arrest this morning," she said. "A middleman named Seth Marlowe." Bob frowned. "I don't know him." Benton exchanged a quick glance with Rachel. "But Julia does." Bob blinked, stunned. "Julia?" "Julia's friend group," Benton clarified. "Financial advisors, real estate flippers, side hustlers. Marlowe's name shows up in 2 group texts and a dinner reservation with her last fall." Bob felt his knees weaken. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, "that someone Julia knows is tied to a criminal network that targeted me?" Benton nodded. "He's one of the connectors, the people who pass information into the fraud ring." Bob sank into the nearest chair. The betrayal wasn't a single wound, it was a web, a network, layers of greed and manipulation reaching farther than he imagined. His son hadn't just stumbled into a bad idea. He had walked willingly into a world of predators. Mark put a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Bob, you're not just fighting for your name anymore. You're fighting to bring all of them down." And for the first time since the nightmare began, Bob felt something fierce rise inside him. Not grief, not panic, but resolve. A quiet, sharpened purpose. Revenge was no longer a distant concept. It was within reach. And the people who tried to take his life apart were about to face a man they never should have underestimated. The morning of the raid began like any other, cold, gray, deceptively ordinary. Bob stood beside Rachel's car in the federal building's parking lot, hands tucked into his jacket pockets as the wind bit through the seams. Mark hovered nearby, quiet but watchful. They weren't here to confront anyone. They were here to witness the truth fall into the light. And it happened fast. Unmarked SUVs screeched into the lot, tires spitting slush. Doors flew open. Agents in FBI windbreakers streamed toward the Department of Homeland Security annex like a storm breaking through walls. Their voices echoed through the courtyard, sharp commands, clipped radio chatter, the kind of organized chaos only federal agents moved with. Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. "It's happening," she murmured. "They got the warrant." Bob swallowed hard. He didn't know whether to feel relief, dread, or both. Through the glass entryway, he saw Kara Summers at her desk, oblivious, flipping through a folder. Then she looked up, confusion flashing across her face as she saw the agents pouring toward her office. Her expression shifted, confusion into irritation, irritation into panic. She stood so quickly her chair toppled. "What is this?" she shouted, voice muffled by distance and glass. The agents didn't answer. They pushed into her office, surrounding her, seizing binders, hard drives, sealed evidence boxes. One agent opened her file drawers, another produced zip ties. Kara's face drained of color. She wasn't in control anymore, not even close. Rachel exhaled slowly. "They're seizing everything, exactly what we needed." Bob felt a strange heaviness in his chest, not satisfaction, not vindication, just the raw weight of seeing someone who tried to destroy him suddenly stripped of power. Inside the office, Kara backed against the wall, palms up as if bracing for impact. Wait, this isn't me. I was following orders. I was told he was a danger." But no one listened. Then came the twist. As two agents cuffed her wrists, Kara's composure cracked like thin ice under pressure. "It wasn't just me," she screamed. "It was the family, the Callahan son and his wife, their voluntary participants. They provided the information. They pushed for the flags." Bob's breath left his lungs. Rachel froze. She named Evan and Julia. Bob's vision blurred for a moment, not from shock, but from the brutal confirmation of what he already feared. Inside, one agent asked sharply, "Names full." Kara Summers swallowed, voice shrill. "Evan Callahan and Julia Callahan. They gave me everything. Social security info, pension details. He told me his father wouldn't notice." Bob closed his eyes. Mark muttered, "That coward. He dragged you into this, then acted like you were the problem." But the scene wasn't over. Because two more agents were already moving toward the parking lot exit, where another car had pulled in moments earlier. Evan's car. Bob's heart twisted painfully as he saw his son step out, confused at first, then pale as he noticed the agents walking directly toward him. Julia emerged behind him, clutching her purse, eyes darting wildly. "What's going on?" Evan called out, voice cracking just slightly. The agents didn't answer. They surrounded him swiftly, badges raised. "Evan Callahan." He nodded hesitantly. "You need to come with us for questioning." Julia's scream tore across the lot. No, he didn't do anything. You don't understand." She grabbed at Evan's sleeve, hysterical, her breath coming in sharp, high-pitched sobs. They tricked us. Evan, tell them." Evan didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at Bob either. He just broke. "Dad," even the single syllable trembled. I didn't mean." Bob raised a hand, not in forgiveness, not in fury, but in refusal. Evan's voice died in his throat. The agents led him to a vehicle, while Julia collapsed against the hood of their car, sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect composure shattered like thin glass slammed against concrete. Bob watched, devastated but unblinking. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was loss, the kind of loss that carved into a man and left scars no one else could see. Rachel touched Bob's arm gently. "He'll face questioning, not charges yet. Julia too. They'll sort out motives, money, involvement. Bob nodded numbly. He could barely feel his legs. Then Rachel's phone buzzed again. She answered, listened, then smiled in a rare way, relief mixed with righteous victory. "Bob," she said, turning to him, "it's done. All fraudulent charges against you are dismissed, fully, permanently. You're cleared." Bob exhaled shakily. "And DHS," Rachel continued, "has issued an official apology for the incident. They admitted internal corruption and acknowledged that you were targeted." Bob didn't move. He just stood there, letting the news settle like snow after a storm. Mark clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You're free, old friend." Free. A word Bob hadn't felt in weeks. He looked at Evan being driven away, at Julia sobbing into her palms, at Kara Summers screaming into the wind as agents hauled her out of the building. Then he spoke, quiet, steady, almost to himself. "Now it's my turn." Because the system had cleared him. But the personal reckoning was just beginning. And Bob wasn't done. Snow was falling again on the morning Bob Callahan walked into the Dirksen Federal Courthouse. Thick, quiet flakes drifted down between the tall buildings, softening the edges of the city that had felt so hostile only weeks earlier. Today, it felt different. Today, he wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to reclaim himself. Inside the courthouse, the air carried the familiar mix of paper, cold marble, and quiet authority. Rachel walked beside him, her expression steady, briefcase in hand. Mark followed, a solid presence just a few steps behind, as if refusing to let Bob face any room alone. The clerk led them into the judge's chambers. No crowds, no courtroom seating, just a private, solemn space where the truth would finally be put into writing. Judge Harlan, a stern woman with gray-streaked hair and a gaze that saw through excuses, looked up as they entered. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "please sit." Bob did, hands folded tightly in his lap. He had faced combat zones without shaking, yet his heartbeat thudded like a drum as the judge read the ruling aloud. After reviewing the evidence submitted by Attorney Marsh and the investigations conducted by Detective Benton and federal agents, the judge said, "This court hereby orders that all fraudulent flags, records, and accusations tied to Robert Callahan's identity be permanently expunged from federal systems." Bob felt a breath escape him, slow, trembling, like something heavy finally releasing its grip. Judge Harlan continued, "Furthermore, DHS acknowledges wrongdoing in the handling of your detainment and has agreed to place safeguards to ensure no senior citizen undergoes similar identity manipulation." She lowered the document, her voice softening. "Mr. Callahan, your name is cleared. You may walk freely, without a stain, without suspicion." Bob closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, the weight in his chest lifted. He hadn't realized how suffocating it had become until it finally loosened. Rachel touched his shoulder lightly. "You did it, Bob." He shook his head. "We did it." Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, not for scandal this time, but for truth. Microphones lifted. Cameras clicked. The chaos felt unreal, but Rachel nudged him gently forward. "They need to hear from you," she whispered. Bob stepped up to the podium. Snowflakes clung to his jacket, melting as they touched his skin. He looked out at the sea of faces, local journalists, federal correspondents, even a few older veterans in the crowd who recognized him. "My name," Bob began, voice steady, "is Robert Callahan, and today it is mine again." The murmurs quieted. "I want to thank the people who stood by me. My attorney, Rachel Marsh, Detective Laura Benton, and especially an officer who risked his job to do what was right, Agent Mateo Ruiz." His voice caught, but he continued. "Systems fail, people fail, but honesty doesn't, integrity doesn't." He paused. "I hope DHS learns from this. I hope no one else finds themselves trapped by corruption or targeted because someone decided their life was worth exploiting. And I hope the honest men and women inside the system, people like Mateo, never stop fighting for what's right. He stepped back. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real. As Rachel guided him toward the car, Bob's phone buzzed inside his coat pocket. A number he knew by heart appeared on the screen. Evan. Mark saw it too. You don't have to answer that. Rachel added quietly, I'll block his number if you want. Bob hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. Every instinct in him, every piece of fatherhood wanted to hear his son's voice, to understand why, to demand remorse, to hold him accountable. But then he remembered Evan turning on Julia instantly. He remembered the forged signature, the cold messages, the absence when he needed support most, and the desperate sprint toward the car the day of the arrest. Bob stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. Not today, he said. Maybe not ever. Rachel nodded and stepped aside as he silenced the call. That's your decision, and we'll protect it. Back at Mark's home, life slowly began to reorder itself. Detective Benton sent updates every few days. More arrests, more digital evidence pulled from seized servers, more cracks in the network widening. Kara's name surfaced again and again, at the cent of it all. Bob reviewed his accounts with Rachel's guidance. They corrected records, resecured passwords, replaced identification documents. For the first time in weeks, the numbers on the screen felt like his again. But the nights were harder. The panic attacks came without warning, tightness in his chest, flashes of the airport room, the feeling of being trapped in a system designed to swallow him whole. Mark sat with him through the worst of them, brewing late-night tea or simply anchoring him with quiet conversation. PTSD doesn't care about age, Mark reminded him. It hits when it wants, but you're not facing it alone. Slowly, the worst edges softened. Bob found moments of peace again, morning walks, quiet meals, phone calls from Mateo who checked on him whenever he could. A new foundation began to form, built not on fear but on recovery. By early spring, Bob stood in his own home again. The floors familiar, the photos familiar, the silence familiar, but not lonely. He straightened a picture of Nora on the mantel, his hand resting on the frame. I'm getting myself back, he whispered. Dignity restored, identity restored, strength returning. But as he stepped back, his eyes hardened, not with bitterness but with resolve. Because the legal fight was over. But the personal reckoning was. And Bob wasn't done. The days after Bob reclaimed his identity felt strangely quiet, like the world was relearning how to breathe around him. The chaos had slowed, the fear had thinned, and yet the weight of everything he'd survived still lived deep in his bones. He spent more time at home now, trying to understand who he was after the storm, a man with both wounds and victories, both scars and strength. One afternoon, as he was sorting papers in his living room, a knock sounded at the door. Not rushed, not official, just respectful. Bob opened it. Mateo Ruiz stood on the porch, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets, shoulders stiff with hesitation. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans, a worn coat, and the tired eyes of a man who'd risked his livelihood for the truth. Agent Ruiz, Bob said, surprised but warmed. Didn't expect to see you. No titles today, Mateo replied with a small, self-conscious smile. Just Mateo, if that's all right. Bob nodded. Come in. Mateo stepped inside carefully, as though entering the home of a man he deeply respected. He looked around the modest living room, the family photos, the American flag folded on a shelf, the framed picture of Nora that seemed to watch over everything. I wanted to say thank you, Mateo said quietly, for speaking up for me in your statement. Most people, they wouldn't risk their recovery to defend a guy who broke protocol. Bob shook his head. You didn't break protocol, you saved my life. Mateo's gaze softened. Still, you didn't have to stand up for me, but you did, and that mattered. Bob hesitated before replying. You stood by me when the system turned its back. That makes you family in my book. The words made Mateo look down, blinking away emotion he didn't want to show. Sit, Bob said. Let me get you something. They talked for nearly an hour about the case, about DHS's cleanup, about life after corruption. And when the conversation finally drifted into a comfortable silence, Bob spoke again. There's something I've been thinking about, he said. Mark and I are planning a dinner next week, something small. Benton's coming too, you should join us. Mateo looked up sharply. Me. Of course, Bob said. You're part of this story too. Mateo smiled, not a quick or polite smile, but one that showed genuine gratitude. I'd like that, more than you know. Over the next week, Bob began to rediscover corners of his life he hadn't touched in years. Mark visited almost daily, helping him reorganize the home office that had become cluttered with stress and old paperwork. What do you want to do with all this? Mark asked, holding a cracked storage bin. Bob looked around the small room, the empty walls, the dusty desk, the space that once belonged to Nora's crafts before it became a catch-all for bills and forgotten files. I was thinking, Bob said slowly, maybe it's time this room had a purpose again, a better one. Mark tilted his head. What you have in mind? Bob picked up a framed photo from his military days, young men, proud, exhausted, alive. A memorial, he said quietly. For the guys, for Nora, for the parts of my life worth honoring. Mark's expression shifted into something warm and certain. Then let's build it. They spent 2 full days transforming the room, dusting shelves, hanging medals, arranging photos, placing Nora's favorite candle on the desk. By the time they finished, the room didn't look like an office anymore. It looked like a legacy. As the week went on, Bob found himself reconnecting with people he hadn't seen in years, old neighbors, veteran friends, members of his church group. Word of his ordeal had spread, but instead of pity, people offered support, understanding, respect. A woman from the local senior center approached him one morning at the grocery store. Mr. Callahan, we heard what happened. If you ever want to talk to our group, we'd be honored. Bob nodded, touched. Maybe I will. He was becoming part of the world again, slowly, carefully, but genuinely. One evening, while Bob and Mark were setting the table in preparation for the dinner, Bob's phone rang. Rachel. He answered immediately. Everything all right? Her voice carried a note of satisfaction. Better than all right. Another arrest came through today. 2 more middlemen tied to the same fraud network, and one of them linked directly to the files taken from Kara's office. Bob felt a quiet pride settle over him. So the case is still unfolding. Oh, it's unfolding, Rachel said. And your testimony, your pushback, helped open doors for other victims. You did more than save yourself. Bob leaned against the counter, overwhelmed in a way that felt strangely good. Thank you for telling me. After they hung up, he stood still for a moment, letting the truth wash through him. His suffering had protected others. His fight had meant something. For the first time in a long time, he felt purpose flow through him like warmth. Mark glanced over. You okay? Bob nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I want to do more, help other seniors, people like me. Mark smiled knowingly. I figured you'd get there. Bob looked around his home, at the dinner table set for new friends, at the memorial room glowing softly down the hall, at the life he was rebuilding piece by piece. He wasn't the same man who boarded the plane home from Mexico. He was stronger, more awake, more resolved. And as he heard Mateo's car pull up outside, followed by Benton's, Bob straightened his shoulders. A new kind of family was forming, and a new purpose was calling. The next chapter wasn't revenge. It was redemption. But there was still one thing left to confront. The message came on a cold Saturday morning, short, hesitant, almost timid. "Evan, Dad, can we talk? Face to face, please." Bob stared at the screen for a long time, the familiar ache rising in his chest. For weeks Evan had vanished, swallowed by investigations, interrogations, and the weight of his own guilt. Now he wanted to talk. Mark saw the look on Bob's face and sighed softly. "You don't owe him anything." Bob slipped the phone into his coat pocket. "I know," he said, "but I need to hear him, not for him, for me." He chose a quiet park on the edge of town, open space, bare winter trees, a place where the noise of the world couldn't drown out the truth. He arrived first, sitting on a bench near a frozen pond. The cold air stung his lungs, but it kept him steady. 10 minutes later, Evan appeared. The son who once stood tall and ambitious now looked smaller, shoulders slumped, eyes red and sleepless. He walked toward the bench with hesitant steps, as if expecting the ground to crack beneath him. "Dad," Evan said softly, stopping a few feet away. Bob motioned to the bench. "Sit." Evan obeyed, wiping his nose with the back of his hand as he lowered himself down. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled through dry branches overhead. Then Evan broke. "I'm sorry," he whispered, then again louder, cracking. "Dad, I'm so sorry." Tears spilled fast, messy, as if the apology had been waiting behind his teeth for weeks. "I panicked. I was drowning, Dad. Money, pressure, Julia pushing for a bigger house. I didn't know what to do. I made terrible choices. I wasn't thinking straight." Bob listened. His face didn't soften, it didn't harden either. He simply absorbed the words, the tone, the desperation. Evan kept going, voice unraveling. "I swear I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know Kara and those people were criminals. I thought it was just financial help, just paperwork. I thought it would be harmless." Bob finally spoke. "Harmless." Evan flinched. "You watched me get flagged at the border," Bob continued, voice low, steady. "You watched me struggle. You saw the alerts about my accounts. And you still blamed me. You still pushed for signatures. You still let me think I was losing my mind." Evan wiped tears with his sleeve. I know, and I hate myself for it." Bob turned to look at him fully now. "You weren't confused, Evan. You weren't manipulated by your wife or Kara or anyone else." Evan's breath hitched because he knew what was coming. "You chose this," Bob said. The words landed heavier than a shout. There was no anger in them, no rage, just truth, clean, surgical, undeniable. Evan covered his face with both hands. "Dad, please, please don't give up on me. I'm your son. I made mistakes. Awful ones, but I'm trying to fix it. I'm cooperating with the investigation. I'm trying to be better." Bob looked at him, really looked. The son he raised. The boy who once searched the stand. DS for him at baseball games. The teenager who cried during his first heartbreak. The young man whose wedding Bob paid for, whose future he once believed in. There were pieces of that boy left, but they were buried under choices that cut deep. Bob inhaled slowly. "Evan, I can heal from what you did. I can rebuild what I lost." A pause. "But trust, that's not something I can promise." Evan's voice cracked. "So what, is this it? One mistake and I'm dead to you?" "It wasn't one mistake," Bob replied calmly. "It was a series of choices, all made at my expense." Evan leaned forward, gripping his knees, tears dripping onto the cold ground. "Just give me a chance to prove myself." Bob stood, tightening his coat against the wind. "That's not up to me to give. You'll have to earn it." Evan looked up, eyes begging for something Bob couldn't offer anymore. "Dad, please." But Bob didn't move toward him. No embrace, no comfort, no promise that things would be okay. He simply said, "Take responsibility, that's where you start." Evan lowered his head, shoulders shaking. And for the first time, Bob didn't feel overwhelmed or powerless. He felt steady, clear, in control. Bob turned toward the path leading out of the park. The wind picked up, carrying Evan's quiet sobs behind him. He didn't look back, because for the first time since the nightmare began, Bob wasn't walking in fear or heartbreak. He was walking forward, toward whatever came next. Snow drifted gently outside Bob Callahan's living room windows, the kind of soft December snowfall that made the world look forgiven. The house, once heavy with tension and loneliness, now glowed with warm lights and the smell of cinnamon and slow-cooking roast. It had taken a year, an entire year of court hearings, therapy sessions, cautious mornings, and long nights, but the weight that once pressed on his chest had loosened. Today, the air felt peaceful. Mark arrived first, stomping snow off his boots and carrying a box of homemade cookies Nora used to bake. "Figured we should keep the tradition alive," he said, handing the box to Bob with a grin that reached his eyes. "Thank you," Bob said, genuinely touched. There were years where he thought the taste of those cookies would die with Nora. Now, instead of pain, the memory felt like shared warmth. A knock came at the door. This time it was Mateo Ruiz, dressed in a sweater instead of government-issue black, holding a wrapped bottle of wine. "For the host," Mateo said, smiling. "And before you ask, yes, it's legal." Bob laughed, a light, easy sound that came more naturally these days. "Come in, we're just getting started." Minutes later, Detective Laura Benton arrived with a tray of cornbread and a small holiday plant. "Don't make a big deal about it," she said gruffly, but the softness in her tone gave her away. "It's Christmas. Even investigators get sentimental." They gathered around the dining table, the four of them, people whose names had once been tied to stress and survival now tied instead to healing. They passed dishes, shared stories, and gradually, the night filled with laughter. Real laughter. Mateo told a story about the first time he tried to cook tamales and accidentally set off 3 smoke alarms. Mark countered with a tale about him and Bob getting lost during a training exercise in '73. Benton joined in, describing the bizarre excuses criminals gave her during interrogations. Bob laughed until his ribs hurt. For months after the DHS ordeal, he'd felt broken in ways he didn't understand. Panic attacks that hit like gunfire, nightmares that chased him awake. But now, surrounded by people who had helped save his life, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Safe. After dinner, they moved to the living room. The fire crackled softly, amber light dancing along the walls, warming the small room transformed by new memories. Mark leaned back in his armchair. Benton sipped tea. Mateo sat cross-legged on the carpet, telling a quiet story about his kids hanging ornaments crooked on the tree. Bob watched them with a slow, expanding gratitude filling his chest. This right here was what family looked like now. Not blood, not obligation, but choice, loyalty, shared survival. Eventually, as the night mellowed, Bob stepped away to put a fresh log on the fire. The warmth kissed his face, comforting and alive. He sank into the sensation, letting it soothe the last tremors that sometimes lived under his skin. His phone buzzed from the end table. Bob hesitated before reaching for it. "Evan." Just a single line. "Merry Christmas, Dad. I hope you're doing well." No pressure, no demands, no expectations, no manipulation. Just a message. Mark noticed his stillness. "Everything all right?" Bob nodded slowly. "It's from Evan." The room quieted, not tense, just respectful. Bob typed back, "Merry Christmas, Evan. I wish you peace." He hovered before adding anything more. But he didn't. He pressed send and set the phone aside. Mateo spoke soft. TLY, almost like he sensed the moment. "You don't have to rush anything. Healing takes its own time." Bob nodded. "I know, and I'm not rushing." He looked back at the fire, voice steady. "Distance is its own kind of healing." The night continued, warm and gentle. They exchanged small gifts, nothing extravagant, nothing burdensome, just tokens of gratitude. When the fire eventually dimmed to glowing embers, Bob leaned back in his chair, sinking into a comfort he once believed he'd never feel again. His gaze drifted to the window, to the quiet snowfall outside, to the reflection of the room behind him, filled with the people who had fought beside him when the world turned dark. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his again. He thought back to that moment at the border, the whisper that changed everything, the warning that saved him. "Pretend I'm arresting you. Someone set you up." He closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "I'm finally free." And for the first time in a very long time, he believed it. O'Hare International Airport looked almost exactly the same as it had a year ago, same polished floors, same overhead announcements echoing through the atrium, same lines of travelers dragging suitcases and holiday bags. But to Bob Callahan, it felt like a different planet. The last time he'd stood here, fear had crawled up his spine like ice water. His life had been hijacked by lies, his identity poisoned by people he trusted, and his freedom hanging by a thread. He had walked through these halls as a man targeted, hunted, without knowing why. Today he walked through them as a man restored. He took slow steps toward the immigration hall, hands in his coat pockets, the hum of travelers filling the air around him. Every sound that once made him flinch, the clicking of boots, the buzz of intercoms, the shuffle of uniforms now felt distant, defanged. When he reached the corridor where everything had unraveled, he stopped. The fluorescent lights cast a soft glow over the rows of desks, officers checking passports, families waiting with nervous anticipation. This was the place where his life had nearly been stolen. And it was the same place where one whisper had saved him. "Sir, pretend I'm arresting you." Bob exhaled slowly, feeling the memory wash over him, not with fear now, but with a strange, unexpected gratitude. Footsteps approached behind him, a voice followed. "Didn't think I'd find you here this early." Bob turned. Mateo Ruiz walked toward him, uniform crisp, badge shining slightly under the overhead lights. But now there was something new on his chest, a different insignia, a different rank. "Supervisor." Bob smiled. "They finally promoted you." Mateo shrugged, though pride softened the edges of his expression. "Took them long enough. Turns out when you help expose corruption, people start realizing you're not a troublemaker, you're an asset." "They should have realized that sooner," Bob said. Mateo stepped beside him, hands clasped behind his back as he looked over the hall. "You doing okay, being here again?" Bob nodded slowly. "Better than I expected. It feels different now." "Different good?" Mateo asked. "Different free," Bob said. They stood there in quiet companionship, letting the moment settle between them, the place where their lives had collided, where a split-second decision had changed everything. After a moment, Bob turned to him. "I never thanked you properly," he said. "Not really. You didn't just help me, you risked your job, your career, your safety." Mateo shook his head. "I did what any decent officer should have done." "No," Bob said firmly. "You did more. You saw something was wrong when no one else did. You trusted your instinct, and you protected me when even my own family didn't." The words hung in the air, heavy, honest. Mateo swallowed, looking touched in a way he didn't hide. "You don't owe me anything, Bob." "I owe you everything," Bob replied. "That whisper, it saved my life." Mateo's voice softened. "Maybe, but you're the one who fought back. You're the one who didn't break." Bob looked around the hall one last time, at the officers working, the travelers moving forward, the place that once felt like a trap now reclaimed as part of his story, not the end of it. "We both survived something," Bob said, "and we're both better because of it." Mateo smiled. "You ever need anything, even just a coffee, I'm around. My door's open." "I know," Bob said. "That means more than you think." They shared a quiet handshake, not formal, not forced, honest. Then Bob stepped back, taking in the hall, the bright windows, the long corridor leading out to the Chicago winter. Take care of yourself, Bob, Mateo said. You too, Bob replied, and keep protecting people. The system needs men like you. With that, Bob turned and began walking toward the airport exit. His steps were steady, sure, grounded in the kind of peace he never thought he'd find again. The sliding doors opened automatica. Ellie as he approached, letting in a burst of cold winter air that wrapped around him like a clean slate. Justice was done, his name restored, his dignity reclaimed, his life rebuilt. He paused at the threshold, letting the icy wind brush against his face. A smile crept onto his lips, quiet, earned. And in a voice only he could hear, he whispered, "That day didn't break me, it rebuilt me." Then he stepped into the daylight free, whole and unafraid of whatever came next.